Welcome back to Every Third House by Margery Frisbie. Chapter 13. Tracey closed her bedroom door firmly on the low voices, minimally audible from the kitchen. She didn't want to hear anybody, and she didn't want anyone to hear her. Alone at last, she felt dry, juiceless, like an orange kept in storage too long. She lay with her arms behind her head, staring at the faint variations in the inexpertly painted ceiling. Gradually, her gaze wandered down the sprigged wallpaper to her bookshelf. Maybe there was a copy of Alice in Wonderland. Maybe she could find a companion for her misery, someone who cried as much as she'd been doing. Tracey inspected the titles, her gaze hesitating at old favourites, comforters at other bad times. She'd often cried as a kid with A Dog of Flanders and The Little Match Girl. But she didn't want to cry anymore. Her eyes stalled at the pictorial history of Lincoln that she'd bought from the library. Tracey pulled them away, but the rummaging was over. She was drawn to the Lincoln book, even though she flinched from the possibility of pulling the plug on new waterworks. Quickly bypassing photos of Tad and Willie and Eddie for the more cheerful parts, Tracey found a promising series of cartoons. But she was not amused as she'd expected. The cartoons were anything but funny. They were surly. Tracey fumed at their vinegary tone. Last night she'd been reading about President Lincoln's soul-searching and drudge labour to make the Emancipation Proclamation palatable to the people. He didn't want to tear the country apart further by its publication. He'd struggled with a little section every day, correcting each draft, asking each cabinet member for input. Secretary of State Seward had suggested that the President should not publish until the North had won a battle. Otherwise, he said, this might be viewed as the last measure of an exhausted government, a cry for help, the government's last shriek. Lincoln had agreed and waited until the struggle at Antietam was over. But he made a promise to himself and to his maker that once the rebels had been driven out of Maryland, but once Pennsylvania was no longer in danger of invasion, he would publish the edict freeing slaves. And he did. Tracey punched up a couple of pillows so she could prop a line cartoon up under her bed lamp. It showed a devil holding President Lincoln's inkstand. Next to it, Lincoln was portrayed as a Negro, based on a rumour circulating in the South. Tracey tried to understand the cartoonist's viewpoint. Why did they show Lincoln hanging from a trapeze ring over a gaping crowd, or letting blackbirds escape from their cages? Weren't the cartoonists sympathetic to the freeing of the slaves? She found an English cartoon from Punch. Some unsympathetic caricaturist called John Tenniel shared the Americans' animosity towards the proclamation. He pictured it as gunpowder about to explode. Tenniel? John Tenniel? Wasn't he the artist who put the pictures in her head of Alice and Tweedledum and Tweedledee and the Mock Turtle and the Hatter's Hat with its price tag, in this style, 10 and 6. Tracey felt encompassed by these characters. Once she'd allowed Alice into her head, she couldn't get away from her any more than she could get away from Tad and Willie and Eddie. Is everything in the world stuck together like this? She asked herself. One thing leading to another. My mother being sick, leading me to Mary Lincoln. Mary Lincoln leading me to Tenniel. Tenniel leading me to Alice in Wonderland. Alice, a big weeper, like me. And now Tenniel, like the American cartoonists, a critic of President Lincoln. That is enough of all of you for now, Tracey decided. But one last fact caught her eye, making her think. That's the trouble with me. Before President Lincoln had told his cabinet of his Emancipation Proclamation decision, he had read them a chapter of the latest book by humorist Artemus Ward. Humour. Humour's what I need now, Tracey thought. She closed the Lincoln book and looked for something funny on her shelf, but there wasn't any. But that wasn't her way. She couldn't do it. Lincoln was special. He could soften up a cabinet with a funny story. I don't think it could work for me, Tracey decided sadly. Instead, she settled into the pillows with the Emancipation Proclamation. So famous, Tracey thought, and it's never occurred to me to actually read it. It wasn't easy. Because she was reading a pictorial account, the text was in Lincoln's handwriting. It looked like one of Tracey's own homework papers, lines crossed out, squeezed in words. According to the caption, the last paragraph and signature were in a clerk's handwriting. Tracey had to squint to make out some of the words, but the third paragraph was very clear. That on the 1st day of January in the year of our Lord 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of any state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, here there was a word Tracey could not make out, recognise and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons, or any of them. Tracey jumped. It was a knock at the door. She had forgot there was a world out there, with a grandmother and a grandfather, and Mrs. Embry talking her over. I suppose this is the verdict, she thought. Another knock. Tracey rolled over the edge of the bed and opened the door for her grandmother. Tracey, Alan's on the phone. Tracey's body stiffened as if her grandmother had sprayed her with starch. Alan. She couldn't face Alan. What did he want to know? Why'd she broken down? That's all she needed to think about to break down again. Tracey shook her head and backed off. What should I tell him? Her grandmother persisted. Tracey shrugged her shoulders helplessly. Well, I've called Dr. McIntosh, Tracey. Mrs. Embry thought that was best. I'm to bring you over late this afternoon after her last client. It's good of her to be concerned. What time? Tracey asked. Not that she was going anywhere ever again. About 4. She said we might have to wait a bit. I told her that was all right. What about seeing my mother? Wasn't that today too? Dr. McIntosh thought it might be as well to postpone it. We'll reschedule, she said. About Alan? What am I to tell him? Knowing she was going to see Dr. McIntosh made Tracey less desperate. It wasn't Alan's fault she couldn't bear talking to anyone. In a way, she had whooshed him, coming home with Mrs. Embry after he'd brought her to Crabtree. Who knows what they told him, or any of the kids for that matter. Tell him I am really, truly sorry, but I can't come to the phone right now. Shall I tell him it's all right to call back later? If he wants, Tracey said. And if he can bear to, she added to her grandmother's departing back. Tracey stood in the doorway, training to hear her grandmother's soft, steady explanation, reassuring Alan. She listened for Mrs. Embry's voice once her grandmother had hung up. There was a quick burst of water from the tap, the pop of a toaster, the croak of a reluctant window, footsteps to the freezer on the back porch, but no voices. I guess it's safe, Tracey decided, going back into her room to close up the Lincoln picture book. She was getting hungry. What did Alan want? She managed to ask in a normal voice, coming into the bright, neat kitchen. To see how you were. Her grandmother had fished out some red country-style placemats that were cheerful under the dark corral plates. What did you tell him? Tracey folded checked napkins into triangles and set them to the left of each plate. Fine. Should I have said you'd call back? You didn't do that. No, I simply wondered for next time. I'm not up to much. Mrs. Burkhart labelled the vegetable soup into generous bowls. I made whole wheat croutons, she said, sprinkling them onto the hot liquid. Your grandfather will be pleased. He's not that fond of plain soup. Maybe you'd call him. Lunch is late today. He must be hungry. I know why lunch is late, Tracey mused as she headed for the foot of the stairs. I've upset everybody's schedule, and now grandmother has to take me to Dr. McIntosh and upset her afternoon. Actually, as grandma explained less than an hour later on the way to the hospital, she was going this way anyway. She'd drop Tracey off and do her errands. With luck, we'll come out even. The early morning sunshine hadn't shown much staying power. Diffused clouds herded by stronger, sharper winds had stolen away the early spring toastiness. Tracey shivered, realising she wasn't dressed nearly warmly enough. She wished she'd added her down vest over her sweater. She scooted through the revolving doors and on down the corridor. The greyness had infected Dr. McIntosh's office. It was colder, murkier, less welcoming somehow. Tracey speculated that Dr. McIntosh was irritated at being kept so late on a Saturday afternoon. But when Dr. McIntosh turned from the window, smiling, Tracey sensed that she was the only one affected by the bleak day. Dr. McIntosh was her pleasant self. She came directly to the point. "I was surprised your grandmother gave me a call." She looked quizzically at Tracey over the top of her granny glasses. "You have represented her as so remote, as someone unlikely to react or worry." Tracey waited for Dr. McIntosh to go on, to begin asking questions. She turned her mind back to her arrival at home with Mrs. Embry that morning. It seemed like a week ago now. Had her grandmother seemed remote then, or had she seemed worried? Tracey couldn't tell. Mrs. Embry was there too. Mrs. Embry? My counsellor. I told you about her. The one who suggested Mary Lincoln. She dropped in? No, she brought me back from Crabtree Orchard. I hadn't heard about Crabtree Orchard, Tracey. Maybe you'd better start at the beginning. When I was born? No way, David Copperfield. I don't have all night. Starting with this morning when you got up will do. There must be some reason your ordinarily phlegmatic grandmother made an urgent call. You know I'm a member of the School Ornithological Society. Tracey remembered watching robins out Dr. McIntosh's window. She glanced over now, but there were only starlings stalking the lawn for grubs and beetles, their yellow beaks a certain sign of spring in spite of the weather change. Tracey turned back from the window as Dr. McIntosh said, "Yes," encouragingly. "Oh, spring and fall we get up early and go birding somewhere interesting. This year it was Crabtree Orchard." "What interesting birds did you see?" Tracey dropped her gaze to her folded hands. She stared at the small diamond on her little finger, a gift from her mother, a family treasure, trying to push every other concern out of her mind. None. "Tracey, let's try and retrace your morning. Something important to you and your mother happened." "My mother?" Tracey looked so surprised that Dr. McIntosh began to explain. "You two share serious history. You're alike in many ways. You and I are seeking clues here to discover your past and shape your future. What happened between 7 when you got up and 6:30. Okay, 6:30 and 11 when your grandmother called me." Tracey fixed her eyes in her lap as if she were reading a book. "Alan picked me up at 7. We got to Crabtree about 7:45. Somehow I got paired with Mrs. Embry." "Was this all right with you?" Dr. McIntosh interrupted. "For a while. I wasn't too keen on sitting in a cold blind. But then she got carried away." "By the birds?" "We didn't see many birds." "By the morning. Mrs. Embry thought it was beautiful. She started quoting, 'God's in his heaven, all rights with the—'" Tracey could feel the tears in her throat again. "The world," Dr. McIntosh finished. "And that was too much for you, Tracey?" Tracey nodded, not able to speak. The two of them sat companionably for several seconds. Reflectively, Dr. McIntosh suggested, "You were finally willing to admit that everything isn't perfect in this best of all possible worlds." "I never said it is." "Let me put it this other way, Tracey. You were finally overwhelmed by how little was right in your world." "I guess so." "Would you say you overreacted?" Tracey thought back to the wave of pain that cut through her on that bench in the morning sun under the blooming crabapple, across from that breakfasting nuthatch. An all-right world promised new life from winter backflow, jonquils for dead leaves, fresh breezes for raw winds, blue skies for grey cover, warmth for freezing chill. "I was—" Tracey hesitated, thinking how cold she had felt inside. "I was an ice maiden." "And the tears were the ice maiden melting?" "I guess." "Do you feel better now?" Tracey was surprised to realise she did feel better, even though Alan and the other kids probably thought she was bonkers, even though Grandma had had to make this special trip to Dr. McIntosh, even though she was mortified in front of Mrs. Embry. "Tracey, now maybe we can pick back a little further. Did you act this unreservedly when your father died?" "Unreservedly? Did you cry your eyes out?" "No, My mother said we should be brave for him and continue to be a family as he would have liked us to. So we didn't cry much. And then your brother died. Pretty much the same. We're big on stiff upper lips in our family. It was Dr. McIntosh's turn to follow the starling's awkward promenade on the little patch of lawn. When she turned back to Tracey, she was gentle. Tracey, how did you feel? All bottled up? Yeah, like shaked fizz water that wants to explode the can. That's how she felt the night she was mean to her grandmother, all choked up, but unable to cry and let it out. You couldn't tell your mother how much you missed your father. Never. I was afraid I would make her feel bad. And did she ever confide how much she missed him? No. We never talked about anything real like that. Tracey remembered being bored with how her mother was, especially when they went out to dinner in some neighbourhood place. If Tracey complained about her teachers or anything, her mother didn't seem to listen. All she wanted to do was speculate on the lives of her fellow diners. Do you think they've been married long, that couple in the booth? He can't take her eyes off her. Or, did you see the necklace on that woman who just came in? I bet that cost a pretty penny. I'd do anything not to go out for dinner, Tracey recalled, not worrying if Dr. McIntosh followed her line of thought. I'd make the dinner, even do the dishes and clean the kitchen, anything rather than spend an hour or more not saying anything worth saying. She tried to remember how the dining out began. I think it was after my brother died. My parents went out a lot then. I'd come home to a note and a plate of something to heat up if I was lucky. If you were lucky. If there wasn't, there'd be $1 for some fast food. I'd have liked an egg better, but there wasn't always an egg in the fridge. Tell me, Tracey, Dr. McIntosh cut back to their earlier conversation. Did you miss your father? Tracey pictured life before and after her father's heart attack. Finally, she admitted slowly, I missed being part of a family. Let's go into that next time, Tracey. Dr. McIntosh was on her feet, turning out lights, drawing the blinds. I don't think it's fair to keep your grandmother any longer today. I think we've made a good beginning. She opened the door for Tracey, switching off the light behind her. That is, she corrected herself, I think you made a good beginning at Crabtree Orchard this morning. She waved to Tracey's grandmother, who had come to the end of the hall, and Dr. McIntosh was gone. Until next time, good night.